Is that better? Are you guys getting audio?
Yes.
Okay, yay. We are recording, and hopefully we'll have a couple more trickling on. I'm going to see if I can move my camera to the same side as my laptop so you don't see the back of my head when I'm trying to look at the laptop. All right, I think we've got 4 o'clock. Hopefully, if anyone's trying to join the meeting, I can see it. Sometimes when I'm sharing the slides, it's hard to see people trying to join. Welcome to the Beginner Quilting Bee. This is session 5 of 5, and today we'll be talking about finishing our quilts. And it should be a pretty quick session, and if you're sewing along, you might be able to get your quilt finished on the call, which would be nice. All right, so let's get started. How far is everybody on their project? Does anyone have anything to hold up and show for the camera?
Wow.
Everyone's so quiet.
I made a square.
Yeah. Show us your square. Do you have it with you?
I
Are you
still
showing us? Go ahead, Marquita.
um I still have mine. As I said, I'm still finishing up the rest of mine, but this is what uh they are looking like thus far.
Really nice.
Thank
I
you.
like it. Very good. Yours are nice and square. Yeah, let's see yours, Will.
Oh, that's nice. Like that.
Very cool. I've seen them where if they get a little off square, it still looks cool. It just looks like they're sort of spiraling, like where you have a nice rectangular stripe. It's sort of like a long wedge, like doorstop shape, and it just kind of spirals around. Um, I've seen that done on accident, and it looks really beautiful, but you can do it on purpose too. Just another variation you can do with this pattern. So it's a fun basic skill that you can do a lot of things with. So this was last week. We talked about everyone was going to do their quilting. And this week, we're going to talk about actually finishing the quilt. So this is my mini quilt, and I just did some straight line stitching across there. I'm not sure if that shows up very well in the camera. So this is quilted together, and it's got the backing and the batting and my mini top quilt. So yours would be all of your blocks together into a whole sheet. So this little single quilt block is representing like my whole project. So this is going to be more of a pot holder size, but it fits in the camera better for class purposes. All right, so you're almost there as far as the class goes, and you're sewing at your own pace, which is fine. We're going to talk today about preparing strips. Um, and there are lots of ways to bind a quilt. We're going to go over one method, which is machine quilting front and back. So we'll be joining it to the back of the quilt first and then to the front and see how it turns out. All right. And finished is better than perfect. Everybody is learning something about quilting today, hopefully moving their skills forward. So it's really exciting to see that journey of where your skills started at the beginning of class to where they got to at the end of class. And they'll continue to grow as you practice and take on other projects. So don't worry about being perfect. These are handmade with love, and they should show that little variation here and there. That's what makes them unique, like a fingerprint. Um, so everyone's done a great job so far. Um, And you guys have your blocks, but take a moment to see what a good job you did and admire your beautiful work. Think about how many skills you've tried, how many new things you've learned, and even what you've accomplished so far has taken a lot of effort and care, and they all look really good. So I just wanted to put a slide in there to make sure we kind of took the time to appreciate everything we've accomplished in class so far. All right, so first step is to measure around your quilt. Let me grab my tape. And somewhere I have the little binding strips that I had cut for this. But where did I put them? Did they fall off the table? Let me poke around. Don't look at my messy studio in the background. It's a little bit chaotic right now. I have a customer quilt on the go, and I have been trying to sew with my mom for the past 4 days. So it's a zoo in here. It's a total zoo. Well, we're going to use these strips. Ta-da! I had strips prepared for this, and they fell off the table, and I don't know where they went. So we'll use these. So the strips for binding with this method are the same 2.5-inch strips that we've used for everything else. Some people do a contrast binding, which is a really cute look. Some people do a blendy binding that's similar to whatever you have around the outside of your quilt, and that sort of is more of an invisible finish. It just sort of blends and the quilt just ends. So if you want your quilt to look a little more framed with a little thin frame, you can use a color that kind of pops. And there's nothing that says the binding has to be the same all the way around. So you could use one uniform fabric where you use the same fabric all the way around, or you could mix it up and be scrappy around the outside. It just depends on what you like. So it's another way to put your individual stamp on your quilt and have it finish up a little bit different from everyone else's. So really no rules. The rule is do what you like. So a normal strip that you get off of a jelly roll or a pre-cut 2.5-inch strip. Jelly roll is a brand name. It's a trademark thing. It's like saying Kleenex. But there's other companies that make basically the same thing. It's just a 2.5-inch strip times width of fabric long. And that's usually somewhere in the 40 to 44-inch length after you cut off your selvage. So you're going to measure around your quilt. And I just got here, this just got my tape. Let's have a look. So here's my mini quilt. And I'm going to measure each edge. So this one looks like it's 7.5 by 7.5. Yep, all the way around. So yours is going to be somewhere around the vicinity of like 50 or 54 inches. Will, yours is probably closer to 13 or 14 inches doing a single block. And then you want to add up the perimeter of your block. So 7 times 4 is 28 plus the extra 2 inches. Let's call this about 30 inches. So if my quilt is 30 inches, you want a little bit of extra in there for joining your strips together. And you want a little bit of extra in there so you can have adequate tails to finish up. So for a bigger quilt, I would add like 10 inches extra all the way around. So if my whole perimeter was 280 inches, I would make about 290 inches of strips, give or take. So this one is about 30 inches, and honestly, I can probably do this with a single strip because this strip is going to be about 40 inches or so. But I'll show you how to join them anyways. So first things first, let's get this little mini quilt trimmed. So come on over to the cutting table. And I'm going to unshare this presentation because I think you can see a little bit better. All right, so here's your quilt. Now for you, this would be your whole big, about 54 by 54. All your blocks would be sewn together into a sheet. You would have basted your 3 layers, backing, batting, and top. You would have done whatever quilting your heart desires. So now they're attached and you have your kind of more three-dimensional quilt. When you just have the top quilt, it's kind of floppy, which is why they call it the flimsy. It's just that one layer of fabric. And then this has got more body to it. And then maybe you can see pretty good here. When you're looking at that quilting, what you're really seeing is the shadow of the divot that the stitching makes more so than the thread itself. Especially if you use a nice blendy color, it kind of lets the overall texture of your quilting shine a little bit more. Sometimes if your thread color is too contrasting, it can be kind of distracting. Let me check. It sounds like someone's trying to join. Aha. Hi, Nicole. Are you on? Maybe. Maybe she's on. Okay. So here's, hey, Nicole. Wilby is raising his
Right.
hand. Hey, no worries. We're already started. We've talked about strips. Just add up the perimeter. And for a normal size quilt, I would add about 10 inches. So say you add up your quilt and it's like 280 inches around the outside. I'd like 10 inches to that for your strips. And the strips are going to be the same 2.5-inch strips that you put in your blocks. So like your jelly roll strips, or you can cut your own. And then we also talked about your binding color. You can do contrast, which would give it the look of a little thin frame around there if you want a fun little pop. You can do it blendy if you want it to sort of camouflage and just blend in with the edges of your blocks. And then we also talked about you can do the same fabric all the way around your binding or mix it up. So kind of whatever you like. No rules is the rule. That's the lightning speed recap. Coming up to speed. Will, did you have a question? I saw your hand go up.
Uh, that was an attempt to wave.
Oh, very good. Okay, so my mini quilt is going to represent your big normal size quilt. So this one is really small. What you want to do when you go to trim your quilt is use the biggest ruler you have. So the longest ruler you have, I should say. In real life, I typically use this guy, and he is 24 by 6 acrylic ruler because it gives me a long straight line. And the more long straight sections you can line up and cut in one go, the longer your whole side together is going to be. Imagine if you were using a tiny little 1-inch ruler and you were trying to go cut, 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 cut. There's a lot of opportunity for that line to go crazy. Either make a ramp or make a like a zigzaggy chevron. All right, so when you go to trim your quilt, and it would already be quilted at this point, you might notice, especially on a bigger quilt, a little bit of waviness in this top quilt. And that's because as you added your quilting, it's going to scrunch that fabric in and pull it a little bit in and out. And then you might have little sections where, especially if you've handled the quilt a little bit, where these seams at the edges are trying to open up. So it can be a little bit not perfect. So what you need to remember is when you bind and when you wrap this over, part of that binding is going to cover the edge of your quilt. So you've got about a 1/4 inch of grace there. So when you go to line it up, if you have one little spot where the top quilt comes in and you're like, oh, I don't want to move my whole edge and lose that whole strip of quilt, as long as it's less than a 1/4 of an inch of little batting showing, your binding's going to cover that. And then same thing, if you have a little where it goes out, maybe it's a little bit warped. We talked about when that fabric bacons from being handled and it gets a little longer than it started. You'll be able to trim those off as well. So anything that sticks out from sort of your nice straight line will get trimmed off. Anything that sticks in, as long as it's within that 1/4 of an inch, it will be covered. You do want to make sure that your batting and backing are big enough. And that's part of the reason we oversize those to start with, because you don't want it to scrunch in and have a hole. All right, so you will place your ruler If you have a major seam and you want to use that to establish a right angle, you can do that. This quilt is pretty small, so. And take your ruler. You can either mark and cut with scissors, or I'm using the rotary cutter method. So I'm just going to glide my rotary cutter on the mat right along the edge. And you get your first line. And now it's all flush. The backing, the batting, and the top quilt are in a nice even trim. So this table is a mess, but I will show it to you. This is like an 8-foot long plastic picnic table. And when I'm doing a large quilt, I'll lay it out along the length of this, and I take my cutting mat and I slide it along, and I try to cut the quilt in, depending on how big it is, maybe 3 or 4 lengths of my long ruler. So I get a nice straight shot. So your quilt is big. You might have to place your ruler, kind of eyeball where it's going to go, maybe demo, slide it back and forth and see where your edge is going to go. And you might have to cut and reposition and cut again, because odds are your quilt is bigger than your ruler. This little demo quilt, not so much. So when you go to do the next side, you can choose one of these lines and line it up on that edge that you just made perfect. And that will help you find 90 degrees, so your corners are nice and 90 degrees. For people who like to get fancy, you can actually, I'm going to confuse you, you can cut a little angle here and make it like kind of an octagon, do a little bevel there. That's if you want to go next level. You can take a little 45-degree chunk out of the corner and be extra. All right, so we'll trim up this side. To get it nice and straight, I lost just a sliver of my top quilt there, which is okay. And then I'll find another straight 90 degree. This one, I'm going to go ahead and, I don't know if you can tell, the edge of my ruler is here. Let's get down where you can see. The edge of my ruler is here, and then the edge of my top quilt is in a little bit. So I'm going to position this so I have a little batting showing, so that you can see that a little batting showing is not going to hurt anything. And you'll just make your way. So see that little batting sticking out? That's just to demonstrate if you do have a little batting showing, it's going to be okay. And we'll see that kind of get wrapped up. And then I'll find my straight line. That looks pretty good. And make my last cut. So now you should have your top quilt, which yours is going to be about 54 inches. It'll be all your squares already joined. And you'll have already basted your 3 layers. And you'll have already done whatever quilting you want. And then you'll go around and do that trimming, and you should have nice, tidy, straight edges all the way around. And your top quilt should go to the edge. If a little sliver of batting shows, that's okay. We'll wrap that up and cover it. And then your back should be, you'll see your quilting back there. And this should go all the way to the edge, all the way around. And it would be trimmed. This is like a pot holder. Yours is going to be, much bigger. All right, so now this quilt is ready to be bound, and you can put that aside. Let's talk about joining these binding strips. Let me select a print that has a right and wrong side. Let me just grab a new strip, because I think it's going to look more clear. This fabric will make a good demo. So for the record, I did have some strips prepared for this, and I grabbed them right before the video started, and they fell behind a table, and I don't know where they went. All right, this fabric has these shiny silver dots on one side and plain white on the back. So the pretty side is the shiny silver dots. And what I'm going to do is cut this to represent 2 separate strips. So say my quilt was big like yours, and I needed more than 1 strip to get all the way around. I would have 2 separate strips. There's 2 ways to join these together. One is simply the butt join. If you have an elaborate pattern, this might be better because your length across the binding where those patterns are matching or not matching is a little bit shorter. So you'll take your right sides of your fabric, you'll match them up like so. So the strips are laying along each other. This is method 1. And then you'll do your stitching. So this pin is going to be my pretend stitching. And it's the same seam allowance you've been using. This seam isn't going to match to anything, so you can use the edge of your presser foot. The standard in quilting is typically 1/4 of an inch. If you're comfortable with a different seam allowance, it kind of doesn't matter how much you use. At least 1/4 of an inch will hold the fabric. The rest is dealer's choice. So you've got your strips aligned along the edges, nice and neat. You sew your 1/4 of an inch along the end. And when you fold it open and press, your strips will be joined with a vertical line. And that's one method. If you're trying to hide a pattern match in here, when you fold your binding over, the part of it that kind of shows will just be this little straight line. So if you're trying to pattern match, this is a good way to do it. Now, I do have a lot of bulk here. I've got all those seam allowances kind of all together. When I try to run over that with my sewing machine, I'm going to feel that little doot, that hump when I hit that. So there is another way, and there's no wrong way. Some people swear by one, some people swear by another. You'll develop your preference. In this method, we're going to end up with a diagonal seam, which is flatter. It spreads out the bulk of those seam allowances. Some people think it gives a nicer finish, but if you have a larger pattern, you're going to have a little bit more of that seam that you can see. And if your pattern is really obvious that there's a seam there, you might see it. So here we go. I'm going to take a little straight edge, any old straight edge, and a marking tool. And I'm going to go, so I've joined these at a 90-degree angle. So I got one strip here and one strip here. And where they meet up, where my fabric overlaps, it's like a little square. And I'm going to go from corner to corner of that square. And you'll notice there's a little tip here. So I've got strip going down this way. And I got strip going down this way. And I've got a little tip. So remember that you're going to be cutting off the tip. I'll do a line. This is an easy one to get turned around. So I do recommend, if you're marking, make sure you're marking on the wrong side of your fabric. And if you want to use a erasable fabric marking tool, I'm using a Sharpie because I am bold. But it is a high risk move because if you mess up, you might see that. This can bleed through to the correct side. So I'm keeping my long strips, and I've got this little triangle, and that's the part I'm going to sew off. So these pins will represent me stitching. And that line is your stitch line. And I do recommend that you test this out either by pinching or by pinning, and make sure you have turned this around and figured it out in your head when you sit down to do it before you sew, and then certainly before you cut. So when I open this up, I should have one long straight strip. Now this is a little wonky because these pin heads are huge, so it doesn't lay perfectly flat. But if you lined it up nicely, and your stitch line won't have pin heads, so you'll have a straight line. This top edge of the strip should continue right into the other one. This straight edge of the strip should continue right into the other one. It should be lined up nice and neat. You should have the right side of the fabric facing up on both sides, and you'll have this diagonal seam. And once you open that up and you're happy with it and you know how you want that, you will come back and take whatever, your rotary cutter, your scissors, and you'll trim this. Leave yourself at least 1/4 of an inch for seam allowance. It's not real critical that this be a certain size. You just trim away this little bulk. And you'll join your strips that way. And you just keep going, making these joins, the first type or the second type, whichever one you like, until you have enough strips to go all the way around your quilt. I usually do around the quilt plus 10 inches because it's better to have a little bit extra than a little bit shy. And with this method, you'll notice I'm losing a little bit of fabric every time I do a join. So that little extra couple inches of fabric, when you figure out how many strips you need, will kind of pay for these little trimmings. It'll give you a little slack at the end because you're going to need some tail length at the end when you go to join these. And then a little bit of kind of calculation forgiveness. It's better to trim some off and save that for a scrap project than get to the end of your binding and be short and have to figure out what to do then. All right, so we'll go over it one more time. The butt join method. Right side of a strip, right sides together, or pretty sides together. You're lining up the end flush. You're lining up your edges nice and neat. So your normal seam allowance from the edge, just across the strip. And when you open up, this is already trimmed in the seam allowance, no trimming necessary. This joining method is a little bit bulkier, but easier to pattern match if you have a complicated pattern. These little dots, you're not going to notice that seam. A solid color or like a tone on tone, like this guy, that's just kind of modeled. You're not going to see it on that. But if you had like little sailboats or little rubber ducks or something like that, where you're going to see the emblem, this gives you a little bit less of an area where the pattern is not going to match perfectly. If you wanted to pattern match, you could. And all that means is you're going to slide your piece of fabric back and forth and peek under there until you, like, let's say this was a sailboat. I would try to find a point on that sailboat to get my 2 repeats together. You could do that. Most people don't do that for the binding because you don't see. At the end of the day, it's around 1/2 to 3/8 of an inch on each side that you see. So it might be a little too much sugar for a dime, but you're welcome to do it if that's your bag and that's what brings you joy. Then knock yourself out. So that was method 1. Butt join, line them up on top of each other, right sides together, sew your 1/4 of an inch, open up. The other join is that diagonal seam. So this one is less bulky with all your seam allowances. You'll cross them at a 90-degree, right sides together, line it up nice and neat, and you will sew corner to corner. If it helps you to put that line, put your little straight edge. So this is the corner of my lower one and the corner of my upper one. So these make a square. Go from the little corner to the little corner. Mark. And that becomes your sew line. And if you wanted to pin these to sew, so when I did that before, I was pretending this was my stitching. If I was going to carry this over to my machine, I've got these lined up, and I would pin across where I'm going to stitch. And it keeps them nice and lined up. And then I would carry that to my machine and sew right on this diagonal line. And it always helps to test and make sure this unfolding is going to work. So let's pretend, here's my stitching. I'm pinning right where I would stitch. And when you unfold this, you should, well, it helps if I did a good job pinning. That would help. There we go. When I unfold this, I should have a nice strip that's even along the top and bottom sides and a longer diagonal seam. And this is going to spread out my seam allowance bulk so I don't have a big bump there in my finished quilt. So that's the benefit of this method. You lose a little fabric. It's a little bit more complicated to turn it around. But then when I trim that seam allowance, the seam allowance is going to make like an A shape. So on the front of the quilt, it will go this way. And on the back of the quilt, it will go that way. And all those seam allowances won't stack up and make a bump on top of each other. All right. So after you pick your method and join your strips, we're going to go over to the iron and do some pressing. So let's head over. And I'm going to switch to my real sample. And we're over at the ironing board. So let me pause there. Does anyone have any questions? Did I totally lose you? Did that make any sense? Let me double check if anyone's trying to join. I don't always see it when I'm not looking at the screen. I think we got everybody. Tracking? Everyone's happy? Okay, so now you're going to have one long strip as long as you need for the whole perimeter of your quilt, and for a normal size quilt, about 9 extra inches. If you did that diagonal join, you'll eat up some of that 9 extra inches that you factored in the joining process, but it'll still be a little bit longer than your finished quilt. And it's 2.5 by super long. The first thing that I do when I'm doing this, now they have all kind of fun little cute setups that make this real fast. And if you do a lot of this, it might be worth it to buy like a binding board and all the cute tools, but you don't need all that. So I like to start with my binding on the floor away from me. And I'm going to pull it until I find a seam with my seam allowance little flaps facing up. And then you're going to press those. And same rules as before. If you press them open, it's a little bit flatter, but it's a little bit weaker. If you press them to one side, it's a little bit stronger, but there's a little more of a bump. So if this is a quilt for a show and you want it to be pristine, you can press them open. If this is a quilt that's going to see a lot of use, I would press them to one side if you're going to wash it 1,000 times and all that. And then you'll press your seam allowance, dealer's choice, open or to the side, press them nice and flat. And you'll pull it towards you until you find your next seam, press. Pull it towards you till you find your next seam, press. Do, all the way along. You're going to have multiple strips. You'll probably have 5 strips for your quilt. I think if you got the kit, I counted out so you would have 6, and that gives you a little bit of leeway. There's nothing that says you have to use width of fabric, by the way. You can join short little pieces, whatever you want, as long as at the end of the day, you've got 2.5 inches times a really long strip. Okay, so now your seam allowances will be all nice and pressed flat. And this is going to be the wrong side of your strip, which means your little seam allowance flaps are on this side. The next thing, and I like to do this across the ironing board, I find it's easier to manage the length going toward and away from me. So it's kind of a pile on the floor, and I'm either pulling it this way or pulling it toward me. Because you can really only manage so much fabric at a time. So the next step, you're going to fold this in half. So my raw edges are nice and aligned over here. I'll take my iron, and I am pressing that ironing. You don't need to scrub. Again, none of this fabric is stabilized until the quilt is finished. And you can make it all bacony if you're rough housing on this fabric. And my iron's still getting hot. That's why this takes so long. When your iron's getting hot, this doesn't take that long. And I'm just pressing that in half. So here's my little raw edges. Here's my little fold. And then I'll pull the little next section out. And I'm just going to do this whole strip. It won't take very long because I only have one. So make sure it stays lined up. If you work in short sections, it'll stay nice and lined up. Sometimes if you try to do too long of a stretch at one time, the middle will either sort of bow or the 2 flaps aren't lined up. You can really only line up so much at a time. And you slide a little further, line up nice and neat. Press that. And the next part, preparing our little strips. It takes a little time. It's not too time consuming. Nice and tidy. Do do do. I feel like I should sing the Jeopardy theme song right now, like hold music. Some nice elevator jazz, maybe. And you just continue until you have your whole strip. And then you'll have a really, really long set of strips joined end to end and folded in half. And this is ready to go binding. All right, everybody good? Still tracking? We'll come on over to the machine. We're still with it? Where's my little mini quilt?
Yeah, we're good. We just don't have video of what you're doing, so I don't know what I've done wrong. But I have like your Jacqueline. I have the one where you're talking, and I have Marquita, and then I have Will, but I don't have a screen of what you're doing like I normally do.
Really? Okay, well, let me ask you this. Will and Marquita, do you see the
watch
video?
it afterwards?
Well, tell her so far I found and follow.
But yeah, Mom said that so far she's been able to follow everything. We've got both of our bindings sewn up and together, and we're pressing them, like you had said.
Okay. Okay. Very good. So is everybody else seeing the video?
I'm seeing a video. I had to click on the name and pull up the little square.
Okay, maybe that's it. It might be there, but just not pulled up.
And the Jacqueline Ramsar, which is the one that has the video on right now.
Right. So I use my computer to control the meeting and my phone to take the video because the phone has a better camera. And then it's like, so Ramsire is my maiden name, and that's the one with me. And Massey is my married name. And I know that's confusing.
I can see you really well. You're on my end.
Very good. All right, I'm just going to take a minute and turn down the light on my sewing machine because I think it makes a glare, and I don't think you can see as well with that on. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about getting this binding on. And while you're still pressing, I'm a little bit faster because my binding is so short. So here's my pretend mini quilt. Here's my binding. And I am going to take this open raw edge side. And I'm going to align those two raw edges. First of all, I'm going to leave a tail. And on yours, you're going to leave quite a long tail. Leave yourself 6 inches maybe. And start kind of in the middle of side of your quilt. And you're going to line all the raw edges. So the 2 raw edges of your binding that you folded together and the raw edge of your quilt that you just trimmed. And you will slide that under your machine. And I will do, oops, foot down, needle down, and maybe get the camera where you can actually see that. Can I get in there nice and tight so you can actually see? Come on, tripod, be my friend. I don't think that's getting in there. For some reason, my little preview on my laptop is not showing, which is normally how I see what you guys can see, and I can tell if I'm getting you in the frame really well. Well, how about, I'm sure this is making for captivating TV, me moving the camera. Captivating television. I feel like you're getting the side of my machine and not the needle area. Better? Can you see where my presser foot is? All right, and for this, you will need a pin and possibly a ruler, depending on how calibrated your eyeball is. If you do this a lot and you know the width of your presser foot really, really well, you may not need to do all this. Okay, so I have switched presser feet here. So this is narrower, but you'll use the same one you've used all along. I typically like to do my standard presser foot, which is 3/8 of an inch, but I happen to have the 1/4 inch foot on there, so that's what we're going to use. And you'll sew with your guide at the edge of all these raw edges. So my 2 raw edges, my raw edge of my quilt, they're all nice and neat aligned, and I'm going to sew down the edge. When I get close to a corner, I'm going to stop. Now, for your presser foot, your seam allowance, you'll figure out what that is. This is a 1/4 inch foot, so I know what it is. And you'll measure in from the corner the same amount. We're trying to make a little square here. So however, from your needle to the edge of your fabric, the same distance from this edge of the fabric back, and you're going to stick your pin in there and mark that point. If you've been sewing for a long time and you're very comfortable with that same foot and you've trained your eyeball to know where that is, you may not need to mark it with that pin. So here's the pin. As far as I am in from the edge this way, I'm going to measure in this way, and then I'm going to sew until my needle is at that point. And right about there. It actually clicked on the pin, so I know I'm right where this pin was. And if you have a needle up down button on a computerized machine, when you're close in there, you can use that needle up down button to advance just 1 stitch at a time and get right on that spot. If you have a mechanical machine, you'll use your hand wheel on the right hand side and turn it towards you and slowly guide that needle to just the right spot. Whenever you're trying to do some precise sewing, that's your sort of go slow, stitch at a time method. So now my needle is down, and I'm going to take my presser foot up. You might have a lever back here. You might have a button. So needle down, presser foot up, and that's how you pivot. I'm going to turn this so that my little corner, I'm going to take you right out. I might regret this because now I got to get back in. And kind of switch you around. I shouldn't do the up the nose cam, that's for sure. Nobody wants to see that. There we go. So this little corner is lined up with where my needle is going. And I have this guide. You might have a 0 line. So you can see there's 0, 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 inch, 5/8. That's from the needle position. So you'll line it up with either your 0 line, if you have another guide on there. And we're going to sew off the corner of that quilt. I like to do a little back stitch there as well. So let's see if I can do this with one hand while I'm holding the camera. So I'm just sewing on top of the binding straight to my corner and maybe do a little back stitch. And then we can cut threads and remove your piece from the machine. So if you don't have a computerized machine with the little thread cutter button, you will lift your needle in your presser foot, pull it out, and cut your threads. Okay, so now we're on to the next side. We'll come back to that tripod later. So I sewed this side, and I'm on to the next side. So what I'm going to do is lift this up so that my raw edge of my new side where I'm going is lined up with my raw edge of my binding. So I get this like 45-degree angle here, and I have a little pleat. So I don't know if I said this before, we're on the back of the quilt. And you're going to machine stitch this down. There's a lot of ways to do this. This is the one I teach. I think it gives a nice, repeatable, neat finish. So I have this lined up. So I have a nice, straight, continuous line from my raw edge of my binding, which I've flipped up, and my new raw edge of my quilt where I'm headed. And then I'm going to fold this down. I'm doing this one-handed, so sorry if it's a little interesting. So my fold lines up with the old. Raw lines up with raw. Fold lines up with old. And I should have a nice, neat 90-degree corner with this little fold and this little raw edge, which should be lined up with my new raw edge coming down. So I'm going to place that under the machine and see if we can do a little stitching. I know this is like a roller coaster with me holding this with one hand. We'll get them under there. Put the foot down. Make sure I'm lined up nice and neat here. And I like to do a little back stitching here as well, because that to me gives a nice secure finish and it's a little more durable. That is optional. It'll be okay if you don't. So I like to do a few anchoring stitches, back it up, do a little back tack. And then this is a long seam for you. You can really only align so much fabric, you know, all the way out to the end of your quilt. You're not going to be able to keep up with that. So find your comfortable distance, whether it's 3 inches or 6 inches. Get it all nice and neat. Stitch a little bit. It's that same align, pinch, sew technique we used before. And then stop and adjust. Before you get too far off, just stop and adjust, even if the adjustment is not much of anything. It's better to make frequent small adjustments and keep on track than to just go crazy and sew a bunch of inches and then you're way off, and then you'll see that sort of craziness on the other side when it's finished. So you're just going to do a line pinch sew all the way down until you get close to your next corner. And whether you're doing this by eyeball or you're doing this with your measuring tape, you're going to come in however wide my seam allowance is this way. I'm going to come in the exact same distance this way. So it forms a little square. And right about there. So this is a 1/4 inch foot that I have on my machine right now. I'm going to come a 1/4 inch back from the edge. You'll measure your seam allowance. It might be 3/8, it might be 1/4, whatever you're sewing to. And you will sew nice and slow to the pin or to your magic eyeball of your calibrated brain if you're really comfortable with it. And then I'm going to pivot. So needle down, foot up, and I'm going to sew to this little point on the edge of my quilt. Foot down, sew to the point. Should be a nice little 45. I like to back stitch and really make it secure. And then however you cut threads on your personal machine, remove the piece. Turn. And it's the same at every corner. Raw matches to raw. Flip it up. And you will align the raw edge of your binding to the new raw edge of your quilt, and then fold to the old. I'm going to bring it back down. So I have the fold of my binding lining up nice and neat with the old side of the quilt. So I'll have this little 45-degree triangle of fabric here. And mine is not super tidy because I'm trying to hold a phone with one hand, but yours will be because you'll have 2 hands on the wheel, like a good, responsible driver. All right, and then you'll put your needle down. I like to do a couple anchoring stitches to get me going, a couple back stitches because I like a durable quilt, and then I'll just align, pinch, and sew as many little adjustments as I need to. Another one, align, pinch, sew. So you can see right here, my ironing job was not super perfect. As long as I catch both raw edges in the seam allowance, I can get away with that. If you are a perfectionist and you want to repress that, be my guest. I guess I am a perfectionist because I'm finger pressing it into place a little better. All right, so we're getting to the 3rd corner. It's going to be the same as it was before. My seam allowance in. I'm going to do So that just means if I use the same seam allowance over here as I do over here, I'm going to find that dot where they would cross. That's all we're doing here. So however far in, I'm going to measure that same distance back. And you can use your little tape. You can use a little ruler. You can use your calibrated eye, whatever makes you happy. Place my pin. So that just gives me a visual. So as I'm sewing along, I can't see this edge because it's covered by binding. So it lets me know how far to take my needle. And you can go just one stitch at a time, till you find that corner. Make one more stitch. There I go. Needle down, foot up, pivot your piece, sew down the little corner, and I can see the little tip of my quilt lining up with my 0 line. 0 meaning 0 inches from my needle. So this 1/8 is 1/8 to the right of my needle, 1/4 to the right of my needle, so on and so forth. And then my machine on the bottom has metric. So 2 is 2 millimeters, 5, 7, and 10 is millimeters. People in the UK and Europe, what have you, they sew to millimeters. We do inches here. Forward and backward, cut my threads, and you'll continue that way all the way around. All right, so let's flip this camera. Come on, dude. Where's the button? More captivating television from Jacqueline Massey. Me trying to work my phone. All right, and we'll stick this in here. So you don't have to be motion sick from all my camera wiggles anymore. Okay, so I'm just gonna do, I've got 2 more corners. So I'm gonna do flip it up, raw aligns with raw, and fold it down, fold aligns with old. Raw to raw, fold to old. So this fold should be even with this edge I just finished, and this raw edge, whether it's up, it's in a line with my new raw edge, and when it's down, it should be exactly on top of it. I'm going to put this little doodad in here. I don't know how many times you want to see that with me holding the camera and wiggling around and making you motion sick. So I'm going to put my foot down, take a few anchor stitches, back it up a few, and I'll just zip down this last side. And then this next part is going to vary a little bit. I've got 1 more corner, so I'm going to stop whatever my seam allowance is back from the edge. So that's your 1/4 or your 3/8. Foot up, needle down, so that I can pivot and sew off the corner. And I like a little back stitch. Cut threads. You see that? Little 45-degree going right to the tip of that corner. Raw to raw. And then back down. Fold to old. And I'll have this little flap. And it should make a nice, neat square in the corner with this as one side and this raw edge coming down the other. It should be a nice, neat square thing. And this is going to be a little tight because my sample is teeny tiny. The whole thing's only 7.5 inches. So you're going to be in the middle of your quilt somewhere, in the middle of an edge when you finish yours. So we'll just get to it. And back up. And you will want to leave yourself room to work. So you want enough tails on both ends of your binding loose so that you have got up to like a foot. Maybe on the small side, 8 inches of unbound area in the middle. And let me show you what I'm talking about. And you want to do a back stitch. So where I ended this binding, and I only have a little bit because my side is so short, to leave a gap, I've only got so much side there. So wherever you end your stitching and leave your gap, you're going to do a nice back stitch because you will be handling this and you don't want that to come undone. So I've got back stitching on both sides. I've got a tail, I've got a tail, and I've got a gap. Your little gap to have enough room to work is going to be like 8 inches to a foot of room for space in here. And your little tails on each end, you want to have plenty of tail to cover that up. Okay, let's go back to the cutting table. How are we doing so far? Is everyone tracking? Is anyone completely lost? Not yet. Crooked camera. So this is what you have so far. You're sewn to the back of your quilt. Your raw edges are all aligned, the 2 edges of your binding and the edge of your quilt. So there's the front of my quilt. I'm on the back, and I've got tails on both ends, and I've left myself a good gap in the middle of my side. If this were a bigger quilt, I would have a foot to 8 inches of undone space and nice long tails. Okie doke. Let's look at how we join this. So you'll probably do this join in the same method that you did your joining of your strips, and that'll just make it look consistent. Cord, go under. There he goes. Okay, are we looking? There we go. So if you're going to do the butt join method, so when you were joining strips, it was like this. If you did this the first time around, if you aligned the strips on top of each other and sewed your 1/4 of an inch and had this straight vertical seam there, you will do the same thing here. So you will take your bottom strip. So again, 2 methods. You'll probably want to be consistent to how you joined your strips together. And you'll fold and make a little finger crease. And then you have your other strip. And you'll fold it back so they just kiss. And you'll finger crease. And that's going to make a little mark in that fabric so I know where it is. And you know what your seam allowance is because you just measured it. So if your seam allowance is 3/8 of an inch, you will measure back from this fold, which will be your stitch line. You'll measure back your seam allowance. So if your foot is a 1/4 of an inch and you're doing that 1/4 of an inch, you'll come back a 1/4 of an inch and trim. And you want to be precise because you'll be using the edge of that fabric as your stitching guide. And you'll also be able to see when you scrape with your fingernail like that and do that finger press, you can see that little crease. So this is where you'll be stitching along and measure back however deep your seam allowance is, and you'll snip off. And that's why you need that extra room, because when you take this over to your sewing machine, you're going to open this up and open this up. You're going to place them right sides together and match the little fingernail creases. You can pin that. And see how my, I'm kind of got to fold this quilt that doesn't have any binding sewn to it. I got to kind of pinch it and fold it out of the way. I'm putting pretty sides together, like I always have. I'm aligning across this crease line that I made, and I'll be sewing across that crease line. So you'll have this trimmed, and then when you press that, you'll have one continuous line of binding. So that's method 1. Now, method 2, if you did this one, where'd my other tail go? I'm just losing everything today. Oh, here he is. When you originally bound your strips, if you did this one, where you did them at right angles to each other and sewed that diagonal, and then when you fold it open, you have that diagonal seam, harder to match but less bulky. So you chose this option. You will do the same for this. So what you will do is make yourself a guide. Snip off some of your fabric. And you need an overlap to make a square. So however wide your binding is, That's how long of a gap you need of overlap. Now this is a little tight because my sample is real small. I'm going to take this one and I want to overlap by the width of my strip. So however wide my opened up strip is this way, I need that much overlap this way. This one's going to be a little baggy just because I am so close to that edge. And then you'll do the same thing. Open it up. You can even take this at a 45-degree angle. See how close I am here? See how much I'm struggling to kind of make this open up? If you had more room and you were in the middle of a larger quilt, this would be a much easier time. And you're going to finger crease a nice 45. And then do the other side. Open them up. And finger crease a nice 45. I didn't even leave myself enough room for this. I'm taking my cut edge to the raw edge and making a little crease there. Then you will go right sides together and align those diagonals. Now for this one, it's tricky. So I recommend that you pin before you do any cutting and test it and see if it's going to look like you want it to look. So you got to take this quilt and pinch it out of the way and kind of scrunch this together. And you'll be over at your machine and you'll cross these so the right sides are touching and they're at that same 90-degree angle to each other. And your diagonal lines should match. And same thing, you're going to sew off the tip. So I have this little, it's like an A. And this is the tip of the A. You'll sew corner to corner, test it, and then cut off this little triangle. So you're going to sew off a little triangle. And then when you unfold it, it should lay in place and be exactly the right length that now these two sides will be joined and lay nice and flat and be exactly the right length of your quilt. Let's see if we can do that at the machine. I'm going to do method 1 because my sample is so little. So if I fold back, say I'm going to join here. I fold this guy back. So they're just kissing perfectly. I don't want them to overlap. I don't want a gap in between them. I don't want them crossing over for this method. I want them kissing. I scrape it with my nail and make a crease. And for this method, I will snip off to about 1/4 of an inch, which is my foot. Snip off to 1/4 of an inch. Yeah. And then I'm going to open them up. Align my little creasy lines. So whatever you do with these ends of this strip here is exactly what you did with the binding strips before they were attached. It's a little more messy because I'm trying to get this out of the way. So you can see we're having a long gap in between, and long tails is going to make this way easier on you. Because the closer you are, the more it's all kind of tangled up. So I'm going to align my sides nice and neat. Place it under the machine. I left this sample too little, but it's the sample I was using before, so I just stuck with it. This was the sample I used for a quilting episode. And stitch along. And I do recommend back stitching on this. Binding takes a lot of wear and tear. I'm just trying to hold this quilt out of the way. Did a couple of anchoring stitches. I'm right sides together. I'm going to try to flatten this out and lay them on each other. I'm going to have to do this a few stitches at a time. If you leave yourself enough room, I promise this is not as messy as this looks. And I'm going to go ahead and do a separate video of the method 2 close up and post that to the group because I think it warrants a video. But I've already done my sample this way. Neat as you can, back stitch, break thread. All right, so kind of looks a mess, but when you fold that back over, it should lay nice and flat, just like all the other joins. This one's a little baggy. And then you'll just complete stitching that down. So whichever join you do, the diagonal one or the straight one, after that, you will put your stitch where you put your needle where you left off. Needle in, back stitch because you're starting in the middle of nowhere, so you need to lock that in. Anytime you stop stitching kind of in the middle of nowhere, you do want to lock it in. That's sort of like making a knot. And I'm going to sew to the other side where I had stopped stitching. I'm going to overlap a little bit, say 1/2 inch, and do a little back stitch to lock it in. We'll call that a back tack. So now I've got this little thing with the binding sewn all the way around to the back. And I will do a separate video and send out the link of how to do this join with the diagonal method. And I'll use a little bit better sample so you can see it a little bit bigger. So have I lost everyone? Is that super confusing? All right. Your quilt is much bigger, but you really won't see anything from the front, and you'll have these triangle flaps and these flaps with the fold on the inside, and it'll be one continuous flappy thing all the way around. So there you are. Now we'll go back to the iron. And you're going to be on the back of your quilt, and you're going to go all the way around the edges, get in as close to the corner as you can, and you're going to roll that binding out and press it all the way around. Yours will take longer because you've got a bigger quilt, but you get the gist. Press them out. Get in as close to that corner as you can. It's a little weird because it's, you've got this flap in the corner there. And you want to create a nice, neat, straight edge. The other thing you're checking for, if anything went wrong, if you're shy a little bit of backing fabric, you will notice if you've got any gaps there. And now would be the time to try to correct that, which is probably going to involve seam ripping, possibly retrimming, or maybe repositioning your binding with a little bit more generous seam allowance. So if you cut your backing a little bit short before you quilted and it pulled in and there's a little binding sticking out, and it's just like a spot, you're probably going to have to retrim that. Or take your whole seam allowance and move it a little bit in. You have to be careful because the more seam allowance you take over here, the less flap you have to wrap around to the front, and you can run out of room. If you take too fat of a seam allowance here, you won't have enough fabric to make it all the way around your quilt onto the front. And if you do a different seam allowance on one side than the rest, your amount of binding that shows on the front will be a little bit different. So use that one sparingly. If you didn't cut right, you might have to take your binding off and retrim because there's too much of a gap between the edge of your backing. So if you see gaps over here on this back side, you better correct that now. Because once you sew the front of this down, it gets a lot harder. There's just a lot more seam ripping to kind of fix that. You can always go back and do like a little patch of fabric and sew it on there. You can do repairs the same way you do a repair on an old quilt. But if you want it to look like first time through, you would have to seam rip and either cheat your seam allowance over a little fatter or retrim your edge. So now I've got this kind of mushroomy looking binding that's kind of halfway done. And I can see my stitch line on the front. And what I like to do, these corners are going to have a little bit of bulk. So if I pull this back, I'm going to mind this flap, and I'm going to look at this stitch line on this side and this stitch line on this side. They come to a point, and there's a little triangle of fabric that's past the seam allowance. And depending on how big your seam allowance is, it'll determine how big this little triangle is. And I'm just going to nip off that little seam allowance from the corner, because what that tends to do is make a little bulky spot. And it's hard to sew on, and it's kind of like a weird bubble. So I like to go in, and I see here's the edge of my fabric, here's my stitch line, that little triangle past the stitch line. Be careful not to nick your stitches, because then they'll want to come undone. And you can hear just with the scissors that that is a pretty bulky, there's a lot of fabric there, a lot of layers. Trim off, and there's one more. Trim off. And make sure you hold this flap out of the way. And then when you come over to your sewing machine, you'll again pick the middle of a side to get started. You'll lay this over nicely. If you pull too far, you're rolling up your quilt inside there, and you don't want to do that. If you don't pull far enough, you won't cover up the stitch line. So this is a pretty big binding for how thin this quilt is. My little sample is pretty thin. I want to make sure I'm at least covering the stitch line. And I've got some empty space over here, which is okay. Dealer's choice there. If I want that to be a full binding, I can roll it so it's flush to that cut edge of the quilt, and it's a little bit deeper. How much binding you have showing on the front here has everything to do with your seam allowance and with how thick your quilt is. So I normally do a 3/8. So my binding normally is about like that, and it's full. So since I did that quarter, this flap, less fabric is being taken up here on the back, which means there's more fabric to fold over to the front. And then I have this really generous binding, which is wider. If my seam allowance were what I normally do, which is 3/8, it would be what I consider a happy medium, which is about like that. And if you have a fat seam allowance, you will be able to fold over less, and you'll have a skinnier strip of binding showing in the front. So I had that 1/4 of an inch foot on, and I used that, but my preference in real life is that 3/8. I think it's a nice happy medium. It gives you enough binding that it looks on purpose, gives you enough leeway that you can definitely cover that stitch line, and then it looks nice and full to the edge. And you can also, for your fold, sort of pull the binding snug against the cut edge of the quilt, and it gives you a nice, neat, straight edge. This one with the 1/4 inch, I don't know, to me, that's a little generous. And if I had a block that had like a detail, like a point, like a triangle on the side here, I'm like kind of covering a lot of my piecing. And maybe you don't care. Maybe your block doesn't have detail around the edges, all your blocks. But if you have detail around your edges, you may not want a binding that fat kind of covering up the detail that you spent time piecing around the edges. If your edge is wonky, maybe fatter is better. You can sort of hide more sins under there. So my preference is 3/8, which is going to, if you have a 2.5 inch strip and you use your 3/8 foot, you're going to have, to me, a happy medium, somewhere like that. Okay. Questions so far? Totally lost you? Still doing okay? All right. So
All
the
good.
next, very good. The next step is we're going to edge stitch this down. So top stitching means that normal stitching, you've got your right sides together and you stitch and you open up. Top stitching is you're sewing through one layer on the top the way it's already going to be. So I'm going to position this quilt the way it's already going to be. There's nothing that I'm stitching right sides together and then folding open. Edge stitching is the same as top stitching, just really, really close to the edge. So top stitching, a lot of times people will go a 1/4 inch or a presser foot edge away from the needle like you normally stitch. So whatever your normal seam allowance is would be from the edge to where you're top stitching. Edge stitching just means as close as you can go. Tiny, tiny. Okay, I'm gonna turn this around. Where's my little button? Let's see. Can we get on in there and get a good angle? This might be slightly better than what I was doing before. I can get this tripod to like behave. Behave, little tripod. Okay. So I'm going to fold this over the way I normally do it. So mine's a little deflated there because I was using that 1/4 inch. You will probably want to fold so that this fabric is against the side of your quilt so it looks nice and full. You know what? We'll do it that way. I'm going to fold my fabric against the side. It's a little bit of a generous binding, but I'll get over it. All right, so you'll place your foot down and your needle down. And look how close that is. I'm right on the edge there. So you're on the binding, but just a little bit. And how far in really has to do with how straight you can stitch. If you're a really tidy stitcher and you can hold that consistent, line it up nice and neat and go right on the edge, get as close to the edge as you can comfortably and consistently get. If you are a little bit more wild with your stitching and you haven't really honed that skill yet, as long as your stitching is enclosing all this loose stuff and covering this old stitch line that we did on the back, you can give yourself a little bit more grace and leeway and it'll be okay. So you'll have a little bit of a liftable flap here, and that's not going to kill anybody because it's finished. This is the fold, so it's nice and finished. And as long as you don't have any raw stuff hanging out, it'll be okay. So consistent is better than aiming for a certain size and not being able to hold it. So with this foot, I would go along on the edge here, a couple anchor stitches and back stitch, and then forward. I'm using white thread so you can see it. You would use thread that matches your binding. Let's take a look at that. Can you see? If you're less comfortable with that kind of stitching, you might, I'm going to cheat, this is going to look weird. You might start, you would not stitch over like that. You would just start here to begin with. If you have a narrow foot, you can use this side over here of your foot as a guide. It's a little bit fatter. You'll have a little bit more of a flap, but maybe that makes you comfortable to use this side of your foot as a guide. Let's do a few stitches and see what that looks like. So you wouldn't change midstream because that's going to look weird. But if this is how comfortable you are, you have this little flap. If you're a little less comfortable, you might have a bigger flap, and maybe that's easier for you to be consistent and not go off the edge. If you are very skilled, you can go even closer to the edge. It just depends on your comfort level with making a straight stitch. So when you get to the corner, you've got this like baggy thing here. My preference is to sew from high to low because then you don't have to worry about your presser foot sort of lifting up a flap. And I already debulked this quarter by clipping the outside the seam allowance of my quilt top there. So I'm going to fold this up where it's going to go. This is the new side. This is the side I'm on. I'm going to fold it this way. In an ideal world, this is a perfect 45 here. It may or may not be, and it's going to be great either way. But you do have a nice miter there. And then you'll sew up to it. Stop in the corner. I like to do another pivot here and really give that a durable corner. And if you have matching thread, it'll blend in. You won't really see that. You're going to see mine because I'm using white thread. Sticks out like a sore thumb. So my needle is down. My presser foot is up. Pivot so that my corner points right at my 0 stitch line. And so over. Now this flap isn't exactly at 45 degrees, which is okay. So I'm going to actually turn around and I'm going to stitch back on the edge of that flap. I like to be sewn down. Dealer's choice there. And then you'll return to however far from the edge you were on your previous side. Same one over here. If you want to add a little back stitching there, that'll make it a little more secure and durable. It's optional. It is up to you. If you run out of thread in your bobbin or your top, and you sort of unexpectedly just run out of thread, you will rethread your machine with new thread. You'll back up about a ½ inch, overlap where you left off, back stitch there, and then continue. Running out of thread happens. So I'm going to go right to the edge. In real life, you would not be doing all this zigging and zagging. You wouldn't be changing from the edge of the binding to your stitching, but I'm just going to show you another option. If you're confident, I am going to use the inside of my presser foot as a guide against this fold. Now that is a little more, shall we say, tenuous. You have to align, pinch, and sew very carefully. But in my opinion, I prefer stitching right on the edge. So the amount of lifty flap is minimal and you're really close to that edge. That is my preference. If I were not comfortable doing that all the way around my quilt and it made me more comfortable to use the outside of my presser foot, again, you would not be changing depths as you go. You would pick one and stick with it. If I was more comfortable using the outside of my foot, it's a fatter little flap there, but really, at the end of the day, if someone judges that, they don't need to get your quilt. This one, the 45-degree angle isn't perfect because the 2.5-inch strip really pairs best with that 3/8 inch seam allowance when you originally machine it on the back. So whenever I want to pivot, needle is down, foot is up, turn my piece to wherever I'm going, go out. If your 45 were perfect, you could actually just backstitch. Where's my old stitch? There we go. Pivot and go to the new side. Okay. This join here that I did is a little wonky. And that's just a cautionary tale against not leaving yourself enough room. So if I were to do this over, I would leave this whole side for joining space when I joined my strips together. And I would leave really long tails, and that would give me a lot more space. I'm trying to pretend like this is a bigger quilt than it is. So as far as that depth from the edge of the fabric to your stitching, pick your poison. As long as you are consistent and neat, it will look fine. So it looks dumb because I went all these different widths trying to demonstrate the options to you. Yours, you would use coordinating thread so you wouldn't see that white sticking out. And you would pick, see how this depth looks okay, this depth looks okay, but changing the depth as I go along looks not tidy. So if you like really close to the edge, you like medium close to the edge, you like to use your presser foot, all those are fine, but just pick one. Pick the one you can do consistently and don't be switching around, which I did to show you, but you wouldn't do that in real life. So when you get to the corner, your new side that you're headed to, I like to fold that up first. And then your side that you're on, that folds over. You get a nice miter. I prefer to do it that way. The other way is to fold the side you're on down and then lift this up. But then I'm trying to sew up this little flap, and sometimes your presser foot wants to catch that. So my preference is to always go the same direction so that I'm sewing down off the flap, and I don't have to worry about whether my presser foot grabs it or glides over it, because it's going to glide down over it. So do. And as long as you have a nice coordinating thread color, which I'm not doing, do as I say, not as I do. Press her foot down. I'm sorry, needle down, press her foot up, off the corner, back it up. Try to find where you left off, your same stitch line, so that way when you pivot, they meet up and make a nice, neat corner. If you get over here and it's not, your needle's not in the same right place, you can always just take a stitch. Hiding one stitch along that diagonal line to get your needle in the right place is going to give you a much neater finish than starting out and trying to veer to your stitch point. So whatever depth you picked, just be consistent. And I'm just going to do this really quick. You see me stitch around at different depths. You're going to pick the one that you're comfortable with. You're going to fold the edge you're coming up to under, and then the edge you're working on over to give a nice neat miter. You're going to end in the corner, pivot. I'm going to get the show on the road here for you. You'll notice these corners are nice and flat. That's because I trimmed that excess bulk out of there. It can kind of wad up, and when you're trying to do your security stitches into the corner, you'll have like a bulb of fabric there that never quite lays right. And then your needle has a hard time going through it. And when you're on the edge and you're trying to go forward and backwards, your feed dogs can kind of ball up. So I just don't like that excess bulk. It's hard for your machine to grab it. And then you'll stitch, do. And whatever your consistent width was, when you arrive where you started, you will overlap about a ½ inch and back up to lock it in. Cut threads and remove your piece. You will not have white stitching, so it won't look so, well, I mean, if your binding's white, you'll probably have white. You'll have coordinating. Yours will not stick out. And it leaves you a nice, neat finish with a mitered corner on the back and a mitered corner on the front. And that's how you will bind your quilt. And then it's fully stabilized. You have no raw edges. And this puppy is ready to go into your washing machine and take a little tumble. The washing instructions for your quilt are going to be determined by the most fragile thing in it. So most battings, once they are sewn up into a quilt, can handle regular machine washing. If you used an especially delicate fabric in there, that's going to limit how you wash this thing. But if you use 100% cotton or like an all-purpose thread, which is maybe cotton poly blend or all polyester, those things can take regular washing and drying in your standard way that you do all your laundry. If you use something delicate in here that's heat sensitive, then your quilt is as delicate as the most delicate thing in it. So you wash this the way you wash the most delicate fabric in there. And you know what's in your quilt. So you'll know. It's all 100% cotton. Just throw it in there and you can torch this bad boy in the dryer. It'll be fine. If you use t-shirts, you know, the screen printing on that t-shirt is a little more delicate, so I wouldn't dry that on hot. If you use like a silk, you'd probably want to hand wash this. That would be a very fancy quilt. I don't know that I would start with silk. So you can see where I demonstrated this deeper area. It's finished. It looks all right, but you got a little more of a flap here. And if you don't like that flap, you can go closer and you really don't have like a flap that you can grab. So you'll probably use a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So your binding probably won't wrap this far around, because to me, that's pretty thick. And it doesn't leave as much on the back. So I have quite a difference between my binding on the front and my binding on the back. So the 3/8 is about half. And so you'll have a very even amount of binding that shows as a frame on the back and shows as a frame on the front. And what that also means is that this stitch line here will be just outside this folded area here. So where I sewed my binding on and ironed it out, that stitch line will kind of tuck in here and hide. So I won't really see it on the binding and I won't really see it on the backing. It'll be like right there. So for this kind of antique batting, 2.5-inch strip binding, I really feel like 3/8 is the magic number. Okay, let's hit the slides really quick because you've been listening to me talk a lot. Let's see what our slides look like. I just started with demonstration. Present. A tab. There it is. Oops. Did we have any questions at this point? I know I kind of did all talking and now we're going to do
All good.
all slides. Fabulous. Okay, so you will use whatever 2.5-inch strips you want for your binding. So if you bought a jelly roll, you can use the remaining jelly roll strips. You can cut your own 2.5-inch strips. If you bought the kit, there's enough strips in there included. You can use your leftover strips to go around. So whatever it is 2.5 inches. And then you will piece those together end to end to give you the perimeter of your quilt. And when you're just cutting the strips, you want the perimeter plus about 9 or 10 inches. And then depending on your joining method, you'll lose a little of that excess, and then you'll have plenty of tails to do your joining on the quilt of those last two ends that come back together. When you are making your long binding strip, you do want to get rid of the selvage, which we talked about what that was before, but I have an example here. So this like weird, usually it's white, even if your fabric's not white, and then it'll have words on it and it'll have these little holes. That'll show if you have that in your binding. So normally trim that right off or make sure that your seam allowance covers it. So if this is in the seam allowance, it's not that big of a deal, but you definitely don't want that to show on your strips, your little selvage. For a long time, I said this wrong. That is selvage, S-E-L-V-A-G-E, selvage. It's not salvage. It's not like, oh, I salvaged this from the wreck of a pirate ship. I said that for an embarrassingly long amount of time. And I've noticed a lot of people, even people who've been sewing for many years, they got that word in their head a long time ago and no one ever told them that was wrong. And then a lot of people say salvage. It's selvage with an E. That just makes you sound like a fancy sewist who knows what you're doing. You said all right. So in the slides, we did the butt join method, which is a little bit easier. And that's when you take your two strips, right sides together, and do a simple seam this way. This one's a little simpler to figure out. I like it, and I do it a lot, even on customer quilts, and I find it's pretty good. And my sewing machine will sew over the seam allowances. I don't find the bump to be too aggressive. The bonus that we talked about was doing this diagonal join method. So if I do these at 90 degrees, where am I going to sew? I'm going to sew off the little tip. So I'm going to sew here. So the part I'm cutting off is this little triangle. I want to keep the long strands, sew off the little tip. So you will have one long strip that's long enough to go all the way around your whole quilt, plus your little extra, around 9 inches or so. You just want to have plenty. It's better to have extra and trim it off than to be a little shy. And you saw how difficult it was for me on this little mini quilt because I didn't leave myself enough room and it's like very crammed in there. So give yourself plenty of room. So you'll go to your pressing station, your ironing board, whatever, fold the long strip in half lengthwise, press with your wrong sides together. So now both sides are pretty. And you'll press that neatly into place. And just like when you sew, you can only align so much at a time really nicely. So you'll align a little section and press that and align a little section. Don't try to like lay out the whole thing and whoosh, iron it. First of all, it won't stay. Second of all, you can only really get accurate and precise with so much. You can only like manipulate so much fabric at a time. So small lengths, do it over and over. It's going to give you a much tidier finish. Okay, joining to the back. And we saw this in the demo. We're just repeating. You're going to go on the back of your quilt. It's all the way quilted. It's been trimmed. You're going to place the raw edges of the quilt and the raw edges of your folded binding. And you're going to sew. And you'll leave a tail at the beginning facing away from you. That's not going to be sewn down until the end. Align the raw edges and you'll start sewing around. When you get to that corner, let's see if I could demonstrate. When you get to that corner, so I'm sewing along here. I was sewing along here, fold it up so that my raw edge aligns with the raw edge of my binding. I'm going to fold it down so that the fold aligns with the old edge where I was sewing and sew that down. That's how you turn that corner so you have enough fabric here, and when it rolls to the front, you'll have enough volume to do that neat mitered finished corner. What else do we have? Align your edges. You can pin that, and remember we did that trick where we sewed a nice little diagonal. So you measure your seam allowance and you measure down the same seam allowance, and you can stick a pin, and that tells you how far to stitch with your needle to give you a nice square corner in the corner. It tells you where to make your turn, basically. You take your 45-degree little stitch, come back, and then go down the next side. So when you're doing the back and you're first attaching the binding strip to the back of your quilt, you're going to cut threads and take it out, do your binding fold, and put it back in. On the other side, and it's already attached and you're just wrapping it around, you don't have to break thread in the corner. You just stitch up to the corner, stitch out your diagonal, and stitch on. You're pivoting, but you don't have to break thread. All right. This says 1/4 of an inch away from the stacked raw edges. I would do 3/8. That's my preference. I love the 3/8. I love the way it's even. The amount of binding, the thickness of this frame on the front and back is more even. See, when I did 1/4 inch, I have skinny here and I have fat here, and it's not my favorite. Some people do this, some people love it. It's not my bag. I guess you can do whichever way you like. I like the 3/8 because it gives me an even amount of fabric on the back and on the front. And I also find, so I do see the stitch line that I did on the front, and this white kind of disappears into my backing color, so I don't really see it. So what you see back here is your bobbin thread. So if your binding is a different color from your backing, when you go to do the front, sew this down to the front, your needle thread can be one color to match your binding. And your bobbin thread can be another color to match your backing, and it will camouflage and hide on both sides. That's a little bonus. Your thread on the top, which is your needle thread, and your thread in the bottom, which is your bobbin, B-O-B-B-I-N, they don't have to be the same thread. Most of the time people do, because that's kind of normal. And generally, a lot of times when you're sewing, it's the same color fabric on both sides, so one color matches both. But in this instance, you might have a different color back here than you have in your binding. And that's how you get it to match both sides. Your whatever's on top, you match to your top thread. Whatever's on the bottom, you match to your bobbin thread. So if you happen to have two different colors, that's how you match two different colors with one set of stitching. And then once you're into the binding, I know I said back tacking was optional in quilting, and it is until you get to the binding. And I do backstitch at the start and end. Anytime I start, I backstitch in the diagonal corners. And I like to make the binding really secure because this is the part of your quilt that's going to take the most abuse. People pull the quilt up and grab it. They're going to be grabbing by that. It's also why I like to do this folded over method. There are other methods of binding where the thickness of the binding is one piece of fabric. For those of you that are familiar with bias tape, it's basically the same as bias tape or like seam tape. So this is bonus. This is not what we're doing for this quilt, but for your information, if you wanted to do the single binding, you fold the 2 raw edges to the center and then fold that in half. Similar to like bias tape that you would buy at the store is folded 2 edges to the center and then in half. And then you would sew this on. So this is a single layer of fabric. Some people like that. I don't care for that because there's so much wear and tear on the binding that I think having 2 thicknesses of fabric is a better method. So when I do our method, you'll have 2 thicknesses of fabric. And it just gives you a little more durability. I'm sure that was confusing because I just referenced a method that we did not cover. If you are familiar with garment sewing seam finishes and you've encased, sometimes they call it the Hong Kong something, or just an enclosed raw edge where you would use the double fold bias tape, you can finish a quilt that way too. If you don't know what that means, just gloss over and do what we showed. Just phase out for those 30 seconds. All right, so when you approach your corner, you're going to stop 1 seam allowance away from the edge. That is not the beginning of your presser foot, that's your needle position. And it's easiest so that you can see where it is to mark 1 seam allowance back from the edge with a pin. And then you can see where that pin is and you can see where to stop. And you will pivot, which means needle down, presser foot up, then you can pivot your fabric. Sew off at that 45-degree angle to the corner of the quilt, cut threads. Turn to the new side, you'll lift the strip up, matching raw to raw, fold it down, matching fold to old, put it back under the machine, little back tack, sew down the side. And this all says 1/4 inch. 1/4 inch is kind of standard for quilting. I would use 3/8. And then you'll keep going around until you leave yourself about that 10 to 12 inch gap between where you started and where you end, and a nice long tail on both sides. And then you'll back tack and cut threads. All right, so now you will join. And we talked about this. You'll fold your binding back on each side so that they kiss, perfectly match, not overlapping, not a gap in between. And you take your fingernail and scrape a crease right where those 2 folds kiss each other. And then you will trim. Make sure you're trimming on the right side so that you have a 1/4 inch excess. Open it up. Put your pretty sides together. Match that crease on the 2 pretty sides and sew it together. That way, when it snaps back together and folds, it should be a nice seamless join. And then you've got your raw edges. You just stitch down that last bit, remembering to back tack. All right, refold. You can repress. You can also finger press at that point because it's been pressed once. All right. Always overlap your stitching where you left off about 1/2 inch. Do a little back stitch. That makes sure everything's secure and sort of knotted into place. Then, so you've sewn onto the back, and the fold is, your raw edges are together and they're stitched down, and you've got your fold sort of flapped toward the middle of the back of your quilt. You'll go to the pressing station and iron that out. So roll that binding out and press for a nice clean edge where that stitching was. All the way around, kind of get in as close as you can to those corners. That gives you a nice tidy line. And then when you go to the other side and you're wrapping that binding around, you're not fighting it and you don't have sort of varying amounts of slack here. So if you press it nice and flat, it's already laying flat on the back. And when you flip it to the front, you only have to worry about what's going on the front. So that just makes it a lot easier to press this out. You're just going to take your iron and roll out the binding away like that. Use a thread that matches your binding. Again, if your back, like this one, is a way different color from your binding, So this would be like an accent binding. I could match my top thread to my binding and my bobbin thread to my backing. That's kind of extra. If you don't have that many colors of thread, just pick kind of a medium in between and it'll be fairly hidden on the back and fairly hidden on the front. If it looks good to you, it looks good enough. And then on the front, you'll start sort of in the middle somewhere. It doesn't have to be where you started on the other side, just somewhere in the middle, wrap it around and edge stitch it down. Make sure that you back tack when you start. I like to stitch out my miter and back in the corners. You don't have to break thread. And when you get all the way back, you'll overlap about a 1/2 inch, do your little back stitch, and cut your thread. And again, on this edge stitching, picking a distance from this fold to your stitch line that you can do neatly and consistently is the most important thing. There's no quilt police that are going to say, oh, that's too much of a flap. A flap is fine. As long as I open up this flap and I don't see any raw edges of my top or batting sort of peeking out here, as long as I'm fully enclosed, it's good. I like it to be close, like this one, where there's not a lot of flap here. But again, dealer's choice. If you like it, that's beautiful. None of those are wrong. It's more of developing a preference of what you can do neatly and consistently, what gives you a result that you're happy with, and you'll kind of develop your own personal brand of what you like. All right. Decorative option. So some of you have fancy sewing machines with a lot of decorative stitches. Let's have a look at mine. Some of you do not. A zigzag in this instance counts as a decorative stitch. So look at this machine. It's got all kinds of whoozy what's it. There's like Christmas trees, flowers, all the little pips from a deck of cards, stars. That's like a moon. Some kind of leafy, snowflakes. All right, so let's say you were doing a Christmas quilt or like a wintertime blue and white icy winter and you like this snowflake. What you can do, where this top stitch is, instead of doing a straight stitch, you could change to a decorative stitch. Now let's look at this. Decorative stitches are always wide. Otherwise, it'd just be one stitch wide. It'd be a straight stitch. So look at this foot. See how narrow this hole is? This is a straight stitch only foot. And some of them have like a round hole and it's enclosed all around it. And what that is made to do, if you're going to do a lot of straight stitching, it holds everything down so that your fabric and your thread tails don't get sucked down into your needle plate down in here in the feed dogs. If you're doing a decorative stitch, you want to make sure you have a regular sewing machine foot or a zigzag foot. And I have one here. This is the normal foot that's normally on my sewing machine. It's 3/8 of an inch wide, and instead of a slot or a round hole where the needle goes, you see it's like a wide oval. That's what allows the needle to move back and forth and not hit my foot. So it's got a wide path where the needle can move back and forth. So as I'm doing that decorative stitch, this needle is going to be moving side to side, and I need a space for that. So make sure that you have, this is called a zigzag foot. It's typically the standard foot that comes on your machine. Make sure you don't have a straight stitch only foot on there. And you can do one of two things. What do I do with my needle? Oh, here it is, right in front of me. You can place that decorative stitch instead of doing the straight top stitch, which is more blends in. It's kind of not a thing. You just don't really see it. If you want to do a decorative stitch here, you can place it from the fold on the binding, or you can place it so that part of the design lands on the top quilt and part of the design lands on the binding. And it sort of, the stitching sort of encloses this fold and covers it up, similar to the way you would do applique and you would sew across the edge of that binding and sew it down. So you can do a decorative top stitch instead of the straight top stitch. So just make sure that your foot has a wide opening right here. From here to here, where the needle goes is wide. And then you would pick your stitch. And then before you start, I would test a decorative stitch before I did it on a quilt. and make sure that you're happy with the way it looks. And if you have all the shenanigans over here and you can adjust the length of the design and the width of design, test it out and get it the way you want it first on a little scrap fabric that you don't care about, and decide if you're going to do it on the edge of the binding from binding to deeper in the binding, or if you're going to do it so it straddles that edge from top quilt to that. Test those out. See which one you like. Pick one first and then go ahead and do that on your quilt. So that's your option, is to do a decorative top stitch instead of this straight stitch. Both are good options. The straight one is more the classic, but if you want it to be schmancy fancy and you have all these gajillion fancy stitches on your machine, why not use them? That's also kind of forgiving because it's wider. So if you're trying to hold the same spacing, the wider stitch, if you drift a little bit, the width changes in the design are going to make it less obvious that you're not perfectly straight. So it is a little bit more forgiving because the width of the design changes as you're sewing along and it's wider. So trying to aim it, you sort of have a bigger target. That's my little cheat hack. Anything that you do consistently is going to look great. So the most important thing is that you're happy with it and that it's kind of got that neat and consistent vibe. The design choices you make outside of that are dealer's choice. If it makes you happy, it's a win. There's no quilt police going to tell you you can't do it that way. If you like it, you like it. All right. Does anybody have a sample of their work that they would like to show? So this little demonstration piece is wonky in this corner because where I joined it, I didn't leave myself enough room and it was kind of, ooh. But from this distance, you can't even tell. I mean, if I really scrutinize that, I can tell it's wonky. I wouldn't do this on a customer quilt. I didn't leave enough room. I can feel there's like a hump there where I cheated it and made it line up when it didn't really line up. But I'd probably give that as a gift. I would use this in my house for sure. Good enough. Even with this weird thread color that I did so you can see it more easily in the camera. I probably wouldn't do that on a customer quilt, but it doesn't hurt my feelings. I would use this as a pot holder all day long. Or you can put your little drink on there. Make it like a, they call it a mug rug. It's basically a coaster. Or a placemat. If this were a little bit bigger, I could use it as a placemat for my grandson, who's now feeding himself. So yeah, there's food everywhere. When his mother was feeding him, he was such a tidy eater. And he's right in that stage where he's just learning to feed himself, and it is everywhere. Bless his heart. He's so cute. No one's going to be brave and show their work on camera? How far are you into this project? You don't have to be as far as the classes. Just show me what you got. Everyone's so shy. All right. Oh, here's Nicole.
Mom said she'd show hers if we've got camera. I don't know if we've got. Hold on, let's see.
I see your iron. Oh, I did. I saw your iron for a second.
Okay.
Okay, I see you. I see you.
This is mine. And
Oh.
Oh no. Like, well, because like you've quilted. I haven't really quilted because I haven't touched mine since last week.
But I've got a.
But Mom has quilted
Can you see
hers.
the whole thing?
Oh, nice. I see you've used like a long diagonal lines.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it all comes together in stars in the little on the accent.
Nice.
It focuses on the accent piece.
Very nice. Kind of arrows going into that.
Yeah. And then
So, how did you find the quilting process? Did you find that like what was good about it? What was tough about it?
She's got me over here on the end of the table. And the first thing you do is clean off the entire table.
Yeah, because that whole quilt is going to be like to the left of your machine, knocking things off. Like your cup of coffee needs to be on the right of your machine because it will be on the floor.
Yeah, but the machine needs to be at the right end of the table. And you need the whole rest of the table because it kept dragging and moving.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
What else?
So when you're quilting, and you've got all this volume and bulk, or even as you're piecing together your rows and you start to get a lot of fabric, as you sew, you might think there's no weight pulling on your needle and sort of pulling your stitches to the side, like, you need to stop and adjust and lift up that fabric and make sure it's not caught on anything and make sure it's not pulling you. It's hard
Yeah,
enough to stitch straight without this whole quilt, like,
right.
off
And I
to
think
the
that's
side.
what Nicole's problem is because she's working on the right side of the table, but I'm on the left side of the table. So I told her, I said, when you get ready to do quilting again, we'll just move everything off this side of the table for her.
Right. Maybe you can face each other so you're both on the right side. Be the right side of this side of the table and the right side of that side. I don't know.
It's one of these folding plastic 2.5 foot wide tables. No.
Yeah, not on her. Yeah, figuring out. So what I do is in my sewing room, I have this table and it's on casters. So when I go to sew, I pull them right up here. And you'll see in the stores, they have these very expensive, fancy sewing nests that are like U-shaped or L-shaped. And the L is on your left because if this were big and I'm sewing on it, all this bulk that's like pulling my needle and like making my stitches wonky, I can put it up on table.
Oh,
And as I adjust it, I'm lifting the weight. So I just bought, I went to Harbor Freight and I got these little metal casters for like $7 a piece. And I put them underneath. This is like a regular, this is actually Christine's table. Thanks, Christine. It's a Costco. Did you get this at Costco or like Walmart? I don't know where this is from. This is an 8-foot table and it's really nice, but you have to have a big room to fit it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I just drag it up so that I have an L-shaped space. And it helps with that weight management because dealing with all that bulk, that's the difference between quilting and other sort of fabric crafts is we got a lot of fabric, we got a lot of weight, and you got to figure out what to do with it. So you got to keep adjusting it, scooching it up, making sure it's kind of up on your table and not dragging you off into the woods. All right, so what did you like about the quilting process?
What did you like about it?
I enjoyed it. It's the first time I've tried sewing in a couple of years, but my knee now bends, so I can actually sew again.
Yay for knees.
Yeah. I have started a little one, and we have a new grandchild, and I found a thing on the internet, which is clearly way out of my league, but we're going to do it anyway. And
Nonsense. It's like eating an elephant.
pardon?
It's like eating an elephant. You can do it. A lot of the patterns on the internet are excellent. And if you just step by step, and they usually have a lot of detail on the old patterns didn't have tutorials. Ooh, foxes.
This is a fox. And there's this one, and then there's a front facing one I haven't started yet. And it's it's in a forest of aspen trees, and I don't know, you probably can't see it, but I don't know if you can see that or not.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Very cool.
But that's okay. That's what grandmothers do, right?
Right.
So that's
It will be amazing. It will be amazing.
I
love that.
Nicole, send you a picture when I am done with it.
Very cool. So the quilting, just like making the blocks, making one block is not that big a deal, but making all those blocks, it adds up. It's a big investment of your time. And the quilting too, do a little bit at a time. And it's like eating an elephant. You just get started and whittle away at it. And you think, oh, I'm never going to get this done. It's so much. And then next thing you know it, you're like, am I halfway done? And then you're just done. So you don't have to do it all in one sitting. Just nibble away at it at the pace that gives you joy.
I think I'm going to leave it all over here, and that way I won't be tempted to work too long and get cross-eyed.
Yeah, if you're one of those people that zones out and does things for way too long, maybe set a timer.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to do this for an hour.
Yes. Yeah, I have that problem.
You to start. If I thought I had to sit down and do it all in one sitting, I would be daunted to even start. But if I said, you know what, I can do an hour. And then who knows, after that hour, maybe you're really in the zone and you want to keep going. I do the same thing with cleaning. I say, I'll just do an hour. And sometimes I'm in the zone. I keep going.
Oh.
All right. was there any other questions? This is our last session. The Facebook group is going to be active, and we'll still be answering each other's questions and sharing our work, and I'm still on there all the time. So that does not go away, but this is our last live session. And you can continue to ask questions either on any of the platforms. You can even text me, and I can do a mini topic. I'm going to do a mini topic on how to do the diagonal join, the last join where you loop the binding back to itself. So I showed the butting it together method. I'll do a close-up video of the diagonal method and maybe a better video of this that's more clear. But if there's any other mini topics that you're like, how do you do this? Feel free to pop that anywhere in any of the comments or text me or whatever, and I'll put together a short little, 5-minute video on whatever that is, because everyone has the same questions. They're just too shy to ask. All right. Well, if that's it, thank you all for joining. Keep me posted on the progress of your quilts, because I know they'll all be beautiful, and it'll be really great for everyone to see each other's colorways and how it went. If you're struggling with something, just because the class is over, you're not alone. The Facebook group is still active. And happy sewing. I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Yay.